So I've gotten some comments about me taking too long to get to the point of the video. Some people say that I keep yapping about things just to extend the watch time or something, but usually there's some sort of a story to every problem. And I mean, if you're not interested in any of that, you can click here to skip to the actual issue described in the video's title, or just skip around the video yourself, or don't watch it. All the controls are at your end, dear viewer. If you do like a story, and hopefully a good one, feel free to stick around. Thanks. So this here is a pretty rare sight. It's an original PS1 memory card, still in its original packaging. Now, back in my day, these weren't as common, at least where I grew up in. Kids and parents were trying to save every penny they could, so if a kid did get a PS1 for birthday or Christmas or whatever, every single one of those A had a mod chip in it, B had a stack of burned or pirated games next to it, sometimes in a binder, and C had a bunch of third-party cheap peripherals. The PlayStation itself did come with an original controller, but if you wanted a second or a third one, which I mean very few people had, I don't remember anyone who I knew that had a multi-tap. We mostly played like one-on-one tournaments while other kids rooted in the back. These third-party peripherals were of course cheaper feeling than the real one, and yeah, you usually got the off-brand controller if you lost a game or something, but generally they worked just fine and sometimes had like some curb appeal. I remember having like an LED controller that would light up like a freaking Christmas tree. So yeah, sometimes these third-party accessories did break down because they were lower quality and cheaper, but like I said, they usually worked just fine and they were a great way of affording the upgrades to your existing system. And I don't usually mind using and having them. In fact, in some cases they can greatly improve upon the original hardware, like memory cards for various systems that came out later, which greatly exceeded the original capacity. This is a GameCube memory card with 128 megs of space, for example. I've mentioned this a couple of times on my channel, but me and my buddies enjoy getting together every now and again to play some of these games from our childhood. We have ourselves some beer, snacks, pizza, and just kind of pretend that we're still boys meeting up after school. And we play like Mario Kart on the Nintendo 64. We have a couple of NES games we enjoy playing, like this goddamn volleyball game. This is one of the most addicting and challenging multiplayer games on the NES, and it's, in my opinion, the best 4-player game on the system. It took us like a year to beat it multiplayer, and we had a whole celebration afterwards. It felt like winning the freaking Olympics. Anyways, we also play PS1 multiplayer bangers like Crash Team Racing, Tekken, and Crash Bash. And one time we were at his place and we were playing the game, messing around, and the controllers kept cutting out. We thought it was the multi-tap, which was odd because we have just gotten a new one for him. So we tried fiddling with the contacts, so that seemed to help, but ultimately it just wouldn't work properly. So we started shaming him and calling the poor guy an idiot, but you know, you have to keep your buddies on their toes. Meanwhile, he also had a birthday, and we've gotten him a new PS1 console along with some games. I mean, not new, just new to him, you know what I mean. But then later he calls me up and says that both of his consoles stopped working, and I was like, dude, that sucks. Like, did the laser go out or something? He says, no, the controllers are not registering. I'm like, what? Like, none of them? Yeah, they just don't work at all. And I'm like, okay man, just drop it off with me next time you get here. So he did, and I gave him my known working PS1 so he could continue playing Spyro the Dragon. Poor bastard couldn't play for a week, and he was like in the middle of a playthrough. And when I got the chance, I hooked his system up. I've actually shot some footage back then because I was gonna make a video on like cleaning the controller ports and the contacts, resetting the ribbon cable connections, and so on, because I thought that was it. Like, it had to be something mechanical. But I've booted both of the consoles and they both work perfectly. No issues with the controllers, both ports seem to work fine. I mean, it was bizarre. I again called him up and like asked him, like, did he not hook something up properly or what? He's not known to be very technically minded when it comes to fixing stuff, so we all started just laughing at him, and this guy's like, no, I swear to God it didn't work. And a couple of days later, I get him back his consoles, he gives mine back to me and says, yeah, your console didn't work at my place either. And at that point we were like, dude, is your apartment cursed? Why wouldn't it work? He says, I don't know, I've tried everything. Different cables, different controllers, upside down, sideways, holding it in the air while saying a Hail Mary. Nothing would work. And at that point, I didn't know what to say. I mean, I've done all I could. I've cleaned it out, reset all the connections, gave him my console. So I was like, sorry, man, I just don't know what else to do. So he calls me up at random some days later and he says, dude, it was the effing memory card. And I'm like, what? What are you talking about? The PS1, the reason the controllers wouldn't work. It was the memory card all along. And my guy was so happy he finally figured it out because, I mean, he started to lose sleep. Like, he thought he was losing his mind. Why would it work fine at my place and not at his? It was like this damning puzzle he couldn't solve, and it also prevented him from using his console. He did have some files on it, but I mean, at this point he was ready to smash it to pieces. He didn't care about any of them. So I've decided to make a video documenting this fault in case anybody else out there has the same issue. Looking it up, it doesn't seem to be very common, but I did find forum and Reddit posts about people complaining that their controllers wouldn't work with the memory card plugged in. And it kind of makes sense since the controllers and the memory card shared the same electrical bus. So if the card had a shorted connection or was in some other way faulty, yeah, it makes sense that the controllers wouldn't work. So he gave me the memory card and I've tried it out myself, and by golly, he was right. This thing really makes the controllers not want to respond. But what's weird is the controllers are still evidently getting power because if you press the analog button, it lights up. So that can totally make you think the controllers are working fine. I guess this would make for a hell of a good prank, like you swap this with the original memory card in someone's PS1 mid-play and they can't figure out why it wouldn't work all of a sudden. So now I'm just curious, what's causing this memory card to do that? I wanted to find out, so we're going to take it apart and investigate it. I don't think I ever had a memory card apart, so I was kind of curious what it looked like inside. So after removing the two screws and figuring out that you have to slide it open, I was kind of trying to just pry it apart. I got the little board out. It was a fairly simple looking board. I mean, it had a couple of surface mount capacitors, resistors, diodes, this surface mount microcontroller, and looking it up, I think that's some sort of an EEPROM, so that's probably what's storing your save files. And then you had two epoxy blobs, which is very common on cheaper electronics. But if you're planning on repairing it, it really sucks because it prohibits you from being able to pretty much do anything with it. This stuff is pretty much impossible to remove without destroying the traces or the components underneath. The first thing I thought was, well, perhaps the contacts were dirty. So I took some IPA and I just cleaned them real good, although they weren't even dirty. And to be honest, this would cause like an intermittent failure, but it would usually still work on occasion with dirty contacts. After that, it was time to break out the macro lens and to look this thing in a bit more detail. What I'm looking for are primarily like broken traces or perhaps cold solder joints, something that would cause a bad connection or a short somewhere. But looking at it, I couldn't really tell. It kind of looked like these two components were touching each other, but it turned out there was no short there. So I whipped out my multimeter and started testing the connections. Now, having those epoxy blobs really made it difficult because I couldn't test the connections between the pins and the microcontroller underneath. So I was limited to just checking the continuity between these passive components. And as I've suspected, I found no real issue. I also tested the value of those resistors and it all seemed fine. None of them seemed cooked or anything. But just to be sure, I took my soldering iron and I've made sure to touch up every side of every available component, just in case there are any broken up cold solder joints or something I couldn't see. After that, I've closed it up and went on to test this thing. I put it up to PlayStation again, popped in Resident Evil 3, great game by the way, probably my favorite intro sequence of all Resident Evil games ever. And upon popping the memory card in, Yeah, there was no change. I think it's safe to say that one of those microcontrollers just shat its pants, and there was really nothing to do about that. So, like I said, I think this memory card could be used for like an evil but harmless prank. And as you know, I don't really like wasting or throwing away technology, but I had to respect my buddy's wishes, and let's just say he had other plans for it. Yeah, he wanted this thing to suffer as it made him suffer, and he wanted this thing to die a spectacular death. And I'm not the one who let my friends be mocked by a memory card, no sir. So I took it upon myself to beat this memory card's ass and whip it good. And let me tell you, this thing didn't take it lying down either. This shit was tougher than nails. I mean, I was doing this in my kitchen, so I didn't really want to go full ballistic, but still. I looked at it and yeah, it was properly broken, but it didn't feel satisfying enough. So I've decided to try something else, something my mom wouldn't ever let me do. And as a kid on YouTube, I remember watching this thing called Will It Blend? And I remember watching it and thinking, man, that looks like a ton of fun. I wish I could try that someday. So here it is. I don't think they ever did an episode on an off-brand PS1 memory card, so we're likely making history here. Yeah, take that. That's for ruining my friend's day and making him look like an asshole. At this point, I've noticed that this bastard was actually leaving marks on this cheap blender attachment. Well, I guess it's no Blendtec Total Blender. And I mean, it still held up its shape somewhat, although the smell, the smell was definitely making me say, don't breathe this. Jesus, it smelled like a shoe factory. But it still wouldn't disintegrate like I envisioned it. I was expecting like a powder. So I switched gears and moved to like a metal bowl and tried using the stick blender. And that gave me some better results. It started to look more like something that came out of the blender. And the sounds this thing made were something else, man. It really did sound like the final boss of memory card villains. I guess given the time of the year, you could call this thing like the Grinch of memory cards. Anyway, after it was sufficiently blended, I've transferred it to a little Ziploc bag and wrote a little appropriate note on it. I guess this is going to be my Christmas present for my buddy this year. Cool. I guess it beats socks. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little silly episode. It was certainly something I've never done before, and it was quite fun. Did you ever had anything like this happen to you? What weird console breaking glitches did you experience as a kid or an adult? Let me know in the comments. And I hope this video proves informative for someone who's still playing PS1 games out there and happens to have the same issue, although I do understand it's not very likely. And if not, I at least hope that you had some fun watching me beat this thing into a pulp. And I've certainly found myself in situations where I just felt like hitting some piece of tech with a hammer after it wouldn't work. So yeah, this did feel kind of therapeutic in a way. And if you like watching me play around with old crap, you might want to consider subscribing to my channel. I do videos like this every Monday and Friday, and if you'd like to support what I do, have early access to my videos, and chat with me, you can join my Patreon for just $1 a month, or more if you'd like. Thanks, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.